Hi, this is Ms. Cooper demonstrating my thought process behind doing a complementary colored painting of a glass bottle. Now I'm using watercolors, and I chose red and green as my complementary colors because they would make some nice shades of gray in the middle. Now what I'm doing here is just getting a base coat in because basically all of that bottle has at least a little bit of color except for a couple highlights, which I'm carefully painting around. I take care not to outline them too much, otherwise I get this hard edge on my paint when it dries. So now I've put down a base coat of red, which I dulled down only a little bit by adding green. After some of those parts dried, I started layering a darker red over the areas that get a little bit darker. So I preserved the lighter areas just by painting around them. I didn't use any rubber cement or anything for masking. I did make the one side just a little bit lighter in that middle panel of glass and then darkened the right side to match the shadows that I saw in my photo. Now my edges aren't exactly perfect and clean here, but they don't have to be because I'm going over some of them later. Making sure that area was dry first, I mixed up some red and green off to the side on my palette to make kind of a dark grayish purple kind of color and started filling in the bottom of that glass bottle because where it sits on the table it gets much darker. I also added in some of the shadows that are off to the side because of the way the glass curves a little bit on the edges. I worked on this area a lot, and I also kind of softened some of the edges because, it is glass. A lot of the edges are pretty sharp when I add my paint because of the way the highlights and shadows look. But every once in a while, some areas are a little softer, especially if it's in the middle of a panel of glass like I just did here. Now in these areas, I'm using a brighter red color first and then putting the gray over it to make the middle a little more vibrant so it sticks out at us a little bit more and the edges can fade away into space. So now at this point, you can probably see the separation between the panels a little bit better and understand what I'm talking about when I say panels of glass, because this was not a perfectly round bottle, it was one that had some straight sides to it. You can also see where it's starting to round out at the top because I'm adding a couple more shadows to round it out. It was very smooth at the top, so I didn't leave a lot of hard lines on there. Now I'm kind of reaffirming my edges on here by adding more green and making it really intense. I'm not adding a lot of water here so that it's still fairly easy to blend out like I did just now at the bottom, and so that I can mix some colors into it while it's on my page, which sometimes makes for more intense colors. So I layered some red over my bright green. I'm still adding some shadows and kind of dulling some of my colors by adding red and green back over them, just kind of taking turns with each color. And I'm starting to develop my edges on the other side. I chose to use a little more green on this side to make it look a little different and show how the lighting was different from one side of the bottle to the other. Of course, I still added some red to dull it down, but I wanted to let some of the green show so that you could tell that this was a different side and that the lighting wasn't consistent all the way across. For most of the rest of the video at this point, now I'm starting to add some outlines and add those hard edges. Those base colors mostly kind of blend out all those lighter values, but the shadows on glass tend to be very kind of sharply outlined, and they also happen to fall pretty close to the highlights on the bottom, kind of lending itself to that glass kind of look. Glass is actually surprisingly easy to paint because there's a lot to look at, and there are a lot of little details to include that show the viewer that it's glass. A lot of that is the way the shadows and highlights work. So sometimes glass is a really good thing to practice on when you're still learning how to layer your paint and mix your colors. At this point, I was unhappy with the way the bottom looked. It looked a little gray. I wasn't seeing those intense reds and greens, so I started adding those back in and making sure I kind of let them be their own colors at the bottom before adding any complementary colors back into them. I'm adding more straight up red to this side, again, trying to make it a little more intense and kind of get my painting back. That green is straight from my palette. I didn't even dull it. I just added it right on. I realized I'd kind of been neglecting the top of the bottle, so I started adding some shadows there, especially since the bottom had to dry and I couldn't work back into it. If I tried to work back into it, I would have lost all those sharp edges, and that would be sad because then I'd really have to work to get them back, or it would be almost impossible to get them back. So I started going up to the neck of the bottle instead. Anyway, that's just part of my process. I continued it later, but thanks for watching.